Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have. As a state, it would be one of the great states anyway. This would be the most incredible country visually. If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S., just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago, and makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state.
All right, Donald Trump talked a lot, not just about Canada's sovereignty, but also those tariffs and counter tariffs, and they continue to spook markets. I want to give you a brief look at the way they closed. The TSX, Dow, and NASDAQ all down across the board as of 4:30 Eastern. The S&P 500 suffering its first correction since October of 2023. So as we keep our eye on Washington, as those ministers and Lutnick emerge from that meeting, we'll take you there live the second they do. With me in studio live, as well as Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson. Hi, Minister. It's good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
I have to start off on the prospect of Donald Trump continuing to threaten our sovereignty, and that clip that people heard all day after it was originally made. Yesterday, Mark Carney said that he'll meet Donald Trump on the issue of trade when there's, quote, respect for Canadian sovereignty. Should Canadians take from that until Donald Trump stops saying we're going to be the 51st state, there won't be a meeting, or there will not be one?
Well, I wouldn't read fully that into it, and I think that's probably a question that the Prime Minister designate will have to answer himself. But I would say there are many of us who are meeting with folks in the U.S. administration to try to actually find a pathway through this conversation about tariffs. The 51st state stuff is just ridiculous. It's reprehensible. It's not becoming of the leader of a major power, and it makes Canadians very angry, and rightly so. That being said, we live beside the United States. We are not going to jackhammer ourselves and float off into the ocean. We're going to have a relationship with them going forward, perhaps a slightly different relationship. And so it's important that we continue to talk and that we try to find a pathway out of this very difficult situation. You
just came from Houston, a big energy conference. You've been in D.C. a number of times since Trump was inaugurated. What is your sense from the conversations you have? Like, I think Canadians are taken aback by the threat to sovereignty, obviously the trade war as well. But on that exact issue, are people telling you he's not serious, or are they saying take it seriously? Like, what do you walk away concluding?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think Canadians are shocked, and perhaps shock now has turned to anger. But it's interesting. When you talk to people in business, there's not one person that I've met, whether in Washington or just recently in Houston, who actually think these tariffs are a good idea. People in the energy sector know how integrated our economies are and know that we derive mutual benefit from that. And the most common reaction when you ask them about it is they look at their shoes. They're embarrassed. Even some of the folks that are near or in the administration understand very well that this is a lose-lose proposition, that it's bad for the United States. But, and that's, I guess, part of the reason why each of us continues to talk to a range of folks that are around the president, such that hopefully he will be hearing this on an ongoing basis from people that he actually trusts.
There was something else that I knew I wanted to ask you when I watched that comment be made in the White House, because Mark Rutte, who heads up NATO, was sitting right next to him. And he sat there in silence while all this was said. I understand there's diplomacy at play. There's a whole bunch of stuff at play. But just like they were with Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister in the UK, like Canadians, I think, from the reaction I got as this happened while I was live on radio, are understandably taken aback at the silence from people we thought were our allies, not just in the US, but around the world. How do you feel about that?
Well, it makes me angry, too. I mean, we, you know, many of our ancestors, at least initially, came from the United Kingdom and France, and we've heard very little from the United Kingdom and maybe a little bit more from France. It is a bit surprising that the Europeans have not been more vocal, the Japanese as well, on something that is a fundamental principle that we have relied on, which is the sovereignty of individual states. So, you know, certainly I think one of the things that we need to be talking to folks who have been our long-term allies is to speak up. But let's be clear, like, they're afraid. They're afraid. Like, they're afraid that the way in which Canada is getting treated is the way that they're going to get treated. That's not an excuse for them. They need to have a backbone and be willing to actually stand up for when they know that something's been said is wrong. Just as, you know, we stood up when the United States started saying things about President Zelensky. We were pretty clear, and we will continue to be pretty clear. But yeah, it's disappointing for sure.
We just have a box on the corner of the screen where we're watching to see if anyone emerges emerges from these meetings. You know, hope springs eternal. Maybe something comes out of them that is good news for Canada. But so far, there's nothing that the administration and the U.S. has put on the public record that would lead us to believe, you know, that's imminently possible. I wanted to ask you in the interim. I think Canadians watched this week as an export tax was added in Ontario to energy exports, and they have watched with great interest at the debate emerging at different parts of the country about whether or not that is something we should pursue. I've gotten a lot of comments from people about wanting to be very tough against the United States. Where does the federal government fit into that conversation? Because it was ultimately a provincial premier that made the call this week. We're in a period of transition at the federal level, but do you expect the federal government ultimately to make a call on that? And what would bring us to that line?
Well, I mean, you know, the initial response was targeting a range of goods that the Americans sell here in reasonable quantities, for which Canadians have reasonable alternatives, as a way to ratchet up the domestic pressure on President Trump to change course. And we're seeing it working. I mean, there are Republican senators and governors and mayors of major cities and many American business leaders who are saying publicly this is a bad idea and we need to reverse course. At this stage, you know, we have not looked, though, to escalate this. We are trying to find pathways out. That's why Ministers LeBlanc and Champagne are there right now. I'm sure that's why Doug Ford is there right now, is to try to actually find a pathway through this. But we've been very clear. Like, all of these tools are in the toolbox. If we feel we need to respond by using export tariffs or even export restrictions on things like critical minerals, we are certainly prepared to do that. But none of us wants to be in this tit for tat. We want to get back to a relationship that actually helps benefit both sides of the country, or both sides of the world.
I think you're getting the question, though, and premiers, to be fair, are too, because it feels very difficult to imagine a scenario in which back to normal is even possible right now. There's nothing they're saying that would make me think, oh, you know what, maybe we'll never have to pull out that option because they're so reasonable all of a sudden. So I guess, to be clear, you mentioned critical minerals. There's also oil and gas and potash, and it's the premiers of those provinces in Saskatchewan and Alberta who have most definitively articulated themselves to be against the possibility even of that being put on the table. Would you be willing, if you deemed it necessary, to override that and to do it without their consent?
Well, look, the Prime Minister has met many times with provincial premiers, and I know that when Mark Carney becomes the Prime Minister, he will be doing the same thing. We endeavor to try to find consensus in this country so we can actually move forward as a united Team Canada, but it's never been the case that we require unanimity. We are the federal government. It is our responsibility to actually engage with the federal government in the United States. And there may come a time where we have to take decisions that not everybody will agree with. But ultimately, that's up to the government of Canada. This is an area, the relationship across borders is the federal government's responsibility. So I'm not saying which things we might do this to, nor exactly when, but we are fully prepared to do that if, in fact, we need to do. I would also say we are never going back to where we were with the Americans before. We hope to get to a place where we are not tariffing each other. But this was a wake-up call for Canada. Like, we need to be more resilient. We, since 1988, have become very comfortable that the United States was always going to behave in a certain kind of way. I don't think we can rely on that anymore. And that means we need to knock down interprovincial trade barriers. We need to significantly deepen trading relationships with key countries. We need to strengthen our ports and our railway systems. We need to think about energy infrastructure vulnerabilities that we have. There's a whole range of things that we need to do to lessen our dependence on the United States.
And I asked Premier Smith, for example, multiple times last week about the prospect of, because your other members of your government have talked about, look, no, even if we did make that call, we don't want any one area or one region to shoulder the burden unfairly, and obviously our actions would sort of address that. She feels, because of some of what you just mentioned, or efforts that she would characterize as not up to par on building out energy infrastructure, for example, that the trust between your governments is lost. So when I put to her, oh, well, maybe they'll be able to compensate Albertans for whatever losses they endure as a result of an export tax on oil, she said, no way, I'm not going to believe them if they say they're going to do that. Do you understand that sentiment, and how would you address it?
Well, with due respect to Premier Smith, and she and I actually have a reasonable relationship, I just don't agree with that. If you look at the 3 liquid natural gas facilities, for example, that are actually through FID and under construction, and a 4th one on its way, those 4 together 50% of the volume of gas that actually gets sent to the United States presently. That's enormous diversification. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, like this government actually built it. And that was about diversification and having an outlet to Tidewater. This government has done more to actually help diversify energy from the Alberta economy than any government in the history of this country. So she's just wrong.
I guess the counter to that, though, is yes, you bought the pipeline, you built it. It's having a big impact on diversifying those markets. But why did you have to buy it? What environment had your government contributed to creating that allowed for private sector companies to say, we're washing our hands of this, it's not going to work for us, and you had to step in and spend up now, a balloon cost of $34 billion? Taxpayer.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say I think it's pretty hard to argue it wasn't a good investment for a whole range of reasons right now, but including the fact that the differential that's shrunk is about $10 billion of extra revenue to Alberta every year. But the reason why the government bought the pipeline had nothing to do with federal policy. It had to do with Premier John Horgan saying they were going to do everything, use every tool in the toolbox to block the pipeline from being built. That was the political uncertainty. It was the provinces acting in their own areas of jurisdiction that actually blocked it. And Alberta was unable to do anything to convince British Columbia to actually change course. The only way that we could resolve that political uncertainty was to buy the pipeline.
So is that the only way forward with big energy infrastructure projects if we want to diversify? Because those regional tensions, they have, I think, evolved because of the threat we face, but they've not disappeared.
Well, I mean, look, in terms of energy infrastructure, look at the diversification with respect to liquid natural gas that has happened under this government. The problems that we've had in terms of building energy infrastructure in this country came about under the Harper government when they ripped out the heart of the environmental assessment process and made it impossible to get social license, where it was opposed by every Indigenous community.
Your process that replaced it isn't exactly holding up strong in the courts.
Well, no.
There's been a lot of issues there, too.
Well, so there was the Supreme Court actually saying that we needed to peel back some areas where we were, and we did that. But I will tell you, I was just at what's called PDAC, which is the world's largest mining conference, 25,000 people, and I cannot tell you how many mining companies came up to me to tell me that they had gone through the IAC process, the impact assessment process, and it was way faster and way more efficient than the provincial processes that they actually have to do. So the work that we have done to simplify the processes, to make them more transparent, is actually working, and good projects are finally getting built in this country.
But we're still sending 3/4 of what we make to the United States.
Well, and look, we live beside...
Do you expect that to change? Like, are you going to do tangible things if you're a part of, cabinet to do that?
It depends a little bit on which products you're talking about. But with respect to oil, I don't actually think that's going to change significantly. The refineries that we send the crude to in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast are set up to use heavy crudes. The Americans produce light crudes, okay? So they would have to spend tens of billions of dollars, many years retrofitting these refineries, and they would ultimately be using a product that's more expensive, so it would raise the price of gasoline. It's also the case the Americans produce 13.5 million barrels of oil. They actually use more than 16 million barrels of oil, so there's not an additional 4 million barrels of oil to actually get rid of. So I would say to you, oil is going to be sticky. We will continue to be able to actually sell the oil. Even if the tariff thing keeps going on, the Americans can't get out of it.
Well, and we should point out that they only put a 10%, not only, but 10% versus 25% of that, threat, and then now it's on hold again. I'm going to leave it there. Actually, I have one quick question. Are you in cabinet tomorrow? Can you tell us tonight? Will you be a part of the ceremony at 11 o'clock Eastern?
As you probably know, that's confidential one way or the other, and I may or may not see you tomorrow morning.
Okay, well, had to give it a try. Minister, I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.